Gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming tonight for this event to mark the 20 years since the Dayton Agreement. In a moment I will hand you over to Alan Little, who doesn't need a great deal of introduction, but is a broadcaster, journalist, been at the BBC for a long time and worked in many, many countries, including the countries that we're talking about this evening. Before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone that I will be bringing round, as we are streaming tonight's event live on our YouTube channel. So over to Alan.
Thanks, Millicent. Thank you all very much for coming. It's great to see the house so packed for this talk we're going to have tonight. I want to introduce you briefly to these four people, and we'll kick around the question of Bosnia today, 20 years after Dayton, the Dayton legacy, what has happened to the country in the 20 years since, how it got to the state it's in now, and how we get out of it. And then there'll be an opportunity fairly early in the evening to open it up to you. Let me introduce you from the far side. Kemal Pervanic is a man I got to know after the end of the war. He spent 7 months, I think, Kemal, in Serbian concentration camps in 1992, and came as a refugee to Britain, where he learned English, started working, and has divided his time since then between England and Bosnia, where he, among many other things, he works on projects aimed at reconciliation among a post-war generation, a project called Most Mira, to try to encourage reconciliation across the divides that were opened up in the early 1990s. Paddy Ashdown, you will know, former Liberal Democrat leader, now Lord Ashdown, although he always hates it when I say that, stood out in British politics in the early 1990s as the leading figure who understood most clearly the dynamic of the war in Bosnia and Yugoslavia in general. I got to know him in Sarajevo. He came often very courageously, visited the front lines at great risk to his own person, but also to his reputation, political reputation in the United Kingdom, and went on to serve as International High Representative in Sarajevo from 2002 to 2006, at a time which in retrospect now looks far more optimistic than the situation today. Zrinka Bralo I met in Bosnia in 1992. She was working at the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union. She's from Sarajevo. She left in 1993, and she tells me that today is the anniversary of the day she applied for asylum in the United Kingdom, and has been a refugee for 22 years, and for much of those 22 years has worked on migrant and refugee issues, and is more concerned these days with Syria, of course, than with Bosnia. Anthony Lloyd is somebody I got to know in Bosnia as well. He is the outstanding eyewitness reporter, I think, of our times. He's a journalist I hold in very high regard. He came as a complete rookie, had no journalistic experience. I met him in Bosnia, and I thought, he won't last. He had a camera. He was trying to be a photographer. He wasn't a very good photographer, so he started writing about the war, and within about 6 weeks of being there, he was writing the most insightful commentaries about the war in Bosnia, as well as eyewitness reporting. So he is, and he wrote this book, which is called My War Gone By, I Miss It So, the latest edition of which is here. He's going to sign copies if you want to buy it. I wrote a book as well about Yugoslavia, which isn't here.
I read yours.
For some reason,
I wrote one too, and no one's bought that either.
It's like a speech.
So let me start by asking Anthony. Anthony, you left Bosnia in 1995 and didn't really go back. You went on to many other conflict areas in the world after that. But you've recently been back, presumably to mark the 20th anniversary of the end of the war. I'm going to ask the four of them what they make of the state of the country today, 20 years on. What did you make of it, going back for the first time?
It was pretty much the first time I had been back in 20 years. There were maybe 2 weeks in the intervening 2 decades I had returned to a place which I had known very well for the course of the 3.5-year war. The first thing that struck me was it was almost entirely empty. I think I went back thinking there would be symptoms of some sort of regeneration. In some of the Croatian areas, there was a business regeneration, but in most of the towns I went to, they seemed as depopulated as they had done in the war. Young people are leaving, middle-aged people are leaving. It was a terribly sad place. I don't think many or much of the trauma that the country had undergone had been processed or released at all. And the sectarian divisions, and I don't use the word ethnic divisions because I mean by and large everyone there is the same ethnicity, so it's rather pointless to talk about ethnic divisions. The sectarian divisions were more glaring than ever before and had seemingly been entrenched by Dayton rather than moved on or disseminated. Sure, it wasn't a war, but it seemed a sad, zombified place. I think the word zombified is quite a good way of describing Bosnia now.
Do you think it's one country or two?
Oh, it's two. Two. I mean, it's entrenched totally as two. They can't agree on anything. They can't even agree on the words of a national anthem. It seemed very much two. Separate police forces, separate education systems, you know, increasingly separated.
Kemal, you're there a lot. You live there, partly there, partly here. Do you agree with Anthony's assessment?
Well, I'd say right now no one is really in charge, and that's really problematic. I like to say that I'm back. I spent a few months here, but I spend most of my time in Bosnia. But I would say there is still one country, and I've been going back since 2002, and in 2005 I became involved in, you know, reconciliation work, let's say, which involved some of the people who did a lot of harm to me. And it was disheartening for many, many years. But what's really hopeful is that currently there's a crop of new people, young people, who were either born towards the end of the war or at the end of the war itself. And there's a small group of people who want to see a real change. So I remain hopeful.
Group.
Small group of people, but it can grow. So, and I just came back from the States this morning, and there are young Bosnians in the States as well who want to see some change and who want to become involved politically in Bosnia. So yes, we have lots of problems. We can list, all of us can list all of those problems, but it's a land of opportunities. So it is possible actually to build peace and to build a prosperous society. And we have a lot of positive stories in Bosnia, but very often they won't be reported in media, because our politicians control most of the media outlets. So there are many signs of hope, and not because I and Zrinka and some of our colleagues in the audience are involved in political work at the grassroots level. I'm not saying because of that the change will have to come from the grassroots level, but it is coming from there.
Give me some sense of what it is like trying to promote reconciliation as somebody who hasn't come in from outside, a well-meaning third-party peacemaker, but as somebody who was actually, you know, you nearly lost your life in that conflict, and not because you were caught in crossfire, but because you were deliberately victimized and targeted. What's it like when you go and meet those people you knew before the war, and you knew during the war as your tormentors, your jailers, your interrogators? What's it like when you go and look them in the eye?
Well, we have this shared history, so we know what happened, and they're not prepared to talk to me. So we talk about, you know, about you know, what we can, perhaps how we see our future, and slowly over time things change. So, for example, my Serbo-Croat teacher from my secondary school, he became involved in the project that we've been running for the last 10 years. And of course he knew about our past, and we didn't talk about that. But eventually we reached the point through our work where he kind of apologized to me. You know, he didn't say openly, well, I'm sorry, I apologize. But in one instance he mumbled to himself, but he wanted me to hear him. I really don't know where those 5 years of war passed me, how they passed me. And he was referring to the 5 years of war. And we were slowly actually rehumanizing each other. And this is something we need in Bosnia. And our politicians are driving a wedge between, you know, these young people who were born towards the end of the war and after the war. And they are the biggest problem. Not us who can remember life before the war and what happened during the war, but these young people. So the battle is for them, who are being told. I don't say taught because for me teaching is the most noble profession. They're being taught at school, at home, by their community leaders, that they can't live together. So they speak of the war as if they fought in the war themselves. So we have to work with them to institute some kind of positive change. And that's what we at Most Mira have been doing for the last 10 years. It's a lot of hard work, but it is possible. It is possible because I work with the people who nearly killed me, and now I work with the son of my former teacher who interrogated me and tortured me in the camp, in the Jamalska camp.
Zrinka,
Yes.
is it one country or two?
I've just been to Stolac, so I'm beginning to think there's more countries there. It's actually, there are several countries, there's several layers there going on. So there you know, people who are like me, diaspora. When we go back, we have money, we have great time, we go during a film festival, and it's all one big party, and it's a blast. And then we go away, and the country is empty, and then our friends and families are left with a little bit of remittances and money that we left behind because there's no economy there. So, and then there is this survival class. So it's not poverty, it's just people trying to survive. And that's for me the most shocking difference, that the sort of the asset stripping of the state that happened, all these shopping malls that are suddenly sort of shining around the corner from still completely ruined buildings that, you know, are disputed ownership, so they're not being bought or sold. And, you know, they're kind of, so capitalism moved in and consumerism moved in, and it's sort of glossing over many of these issues, and that's another country. So my mom will say, oh, you know, as long as there's no shooting and there's food in the supermarkets, and then there is electricity. So people are functioning on this basic level, as long as there's no...
92.
92. And it's really hard to move them, or majority, or maybe older people like my mom, to move them beyond that basic fear. And then you have young people who are super smart, who get it, who want proper Western-style democratic state, who are really frustrated, and they're working hard. And over this summer, there was this civil society movement to open up the National Museum, which was closed for more than 3 years because of the obstructionism in the budgetary kind of post-Dayton constitutional sectarian scheming. And they won. They managed to do it, and citizens came out in support. But it's such a hard work. It's,
Just to get a museum open.
Just to get a museum open, which is this kind of no-brainer. And they wanted to open it properly, so not with donations, but proper state budget. We didn't have a government for nearly 2 years, so there was no budget. So there are all these things that are happening, and yet you can stay up all night and have really good time and party, and you know. So that's for me. It's sort of geography of it is not so much in the borders, although it is. But there are all these other layers of multiple personality that Bosnia has.
Hadi, Kemal gave a very optimistic and hopeful and encouraging assessment of it, but the truth is, in addition to what's happening at the grassroots level, I mean, private initiatives like Kemal's, the state is paralysed, isn't it, and has been for a long time.
Yeah, but don't blame the state. At least don't uniquely blame them. I mean, Kemal is right. There are there are wonderful sparks of light, of which Most Mira is certainly one. There are young people now gathering, though the demonstrations turned out to be, well, to go fat and end with nothing. There are some people, I'm thinking of Nasha Stranka, who are forming into, but they're weak, a bit like the Liberal Democrats, really. It's jolly,
Now he knows.
It's jolly difficult to be a liberal in a time of conflict. They're weak and they don't seem to be growing stronger. There are brave men like Dragan Čavić, I think one of the most remarkable politicians in Bosnia, did a huge amount. When I was there to rebuild the state and paid a terrible price with his political career, he's still there, his party is coming back a bit, but not much against Milorad Dodik. Those sparks are there, those lights are there. There are courageous people. Svetlana, Brod wrote this thing, good people in a bad time, and there are plenty of those. But Kemal, the truth is that the sky is darkening. It really is darkening in Bosnia again. It's darkening by the day, by the week, by the month, and certainly by the year. I don't say it will return to conflict. I think that's probably unlikely. For the first time, however, in my life in Bosnia, my connection with Bosnia, I can't discount that possibility. But you know, I profoundly and passionately don't agree with Anthony. I just don't. I'm sorry. I don't take that view. You know, he said that there wasn't the one country because they didn't all agree on a single national anthem. You can't go to agree on a single national anthem in Belfast. Even Her Majesty's opposition, the leader, doesn't like to stand up for the national anthem. It takes 2 years to create a government. Rinka says she's right. It took 2.5 years in Belgium. We are getting sectarianism beginning to establish, or not gone away. We don't have integrated education. You don't have integrated education in Northern Ireland. It takes a long, long, long time to wash away the aftermath of conflict. And what you need more than anything else is strategic patience to see it through. And that uniquely, I'm afraid, the international community has utterly, utterly, utterly failed to show. I don't believe that, as Brussels keeps on criticising, that Bosnia is made up of feckless politicians. I think more courage is shown amongst many Bosnian politicians than is shown in many capitals in Europe, and we would ask of many European prime ministers either. Some of them have taken a really courageous position, and I'll link them in a moment. Nor do I believe you blame this on Dayton. I think Dayton was brilliant for the first 10 years. And by the way, let's just remind ourselves that no post-conflict country has ever made the progress Bosnia made. In those 10 years after the war, it was miraculous. Bosnia was the poster child for what could be done. 1 million refugees reclaimed their own homes. That's the Bosnian right. It has never occurred before. And by the way, I don't think it's ever occurred in any conflict since. There was complete freedom of movement across Bosnia and Herzegovina. That hasn't occurred even in Cyprus for a much longer time later. There were free and fair elections in those 10 years, run uniquely and exclusively by the Bosnians, without bloodshed, without oversight from the international community. In those 10 years, we took the two armies who had fought each other and combined them together into a single army, which is still a single army and responsible to the presidency. We created 3 intelligence services and brought them together under one, under a European law, probably higher standards of oversight than exists in this country. We brought the customs services together into one. It still operates as one. We did something I think is utterly amazing. We created a single indirect taxation system, VAT system, from a fractured, broken, corrupt sales tax in a time frame unmatched in any other country in Bosnia and Herzegovina. When I say we, I don't mean we, the international community. All the things, and I've named some of them, that happened in the 4 years I was there, didn't happen because I imposed them through the Dayton Agreement. It happened because we got them through the democratically elected institution of Bosnia and Herzegovina itself. Yes, the Republika Srpska National Assembly, along with the others, thanks to very considerable leadership by some Bosnian politicians. And then, 10 years ago, Bosnia, which was on a not secure but a definite path of integration, turned around and, thanks to the failure, fecklessness, lack of attention of the international community who thought the job had been done, has been allowed to reverse itself into a dynamic of disintegration. And that's what's happened.
So does it feel like one country or not then, Paddy? If the skies are darkening and the threat of conflict is there again, I mean, what lines do you see that along?
Well, hang on a second. What I'm saying is that countries after conflict take a long time to get to one.
Yes, we know that. So we're 20 years down the road, and you're saying the skies are darkening.
Well, hang on.
The threat of conflict is never before.
Allow me to finish, and I think you'll get your answer. So the first 10 years of real dynamic to create the one country, unique, it hasn't been matched anywhere else, was then allowed to go into reverse. The European Union in particular failed to pay any attention. Milorad Dodik started to track a path towards secessionism. You got what inevitably happens in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is an action and reaction. When he was allowed to get away with it, because we took no sanctions at all, of course, Haris Salajic tried to do the same thing, and the Croats tried to do the same thing. And we moved into a dynamic of disintegration. So the answer is, the tragedy of Bosnia and Herzegovina is the tragedy of lost opportunities. What was possible 10 years ago has been allowed, thanks to lack of attention and will from the international community, to unravel into a country that is now in threat of disintegration. The answer to your question is no. It's not one country, but it could be. And the truth, I think, is this, that the international community now is not going to make it one. It's not going to show that will, that resource. There's only one people who will do that, and that is the Bosnian people themselves. And if they will pick up the cudgels to complete that work, I don't believe that's lost. Bosnia is in real danger. It's in danger of disintegration. It's in danger of something probably worse. We, the international community, have allowed that to happen because of our failure to show the will to continue the dynamic of integration. And if that continues, Bosnia will break up. Into what? You make your own mind.
The difference, surely, Paddy, with a lot of the lot of the examples that you draw analogies with, is that one half of Bosnia wants it to disintegrate, wants it to break up. They fought a war to break it up, and they haven't abandoned the ambition.
Alan, I don't think that's quite true. The problem that I see in Bosnia, and I'm back again there tomorrow, and I keep a close eye on it, is that thanks to the fact that the international community has given up on creating a functional state, all the Bosnian politicians are now investing their political activity not in the state but in the entities. And there is no investment of political activity and will and their future careers in creating the state. So the Bosniaks now are concentrating their work in the cantons of the federation. The Croats are now beginning to talk about a third electoral entity. We know where that leaves, in Herzegovina. So because we allowed the Serbs to get away with secessionism, everybody else is on secessionism. And I think the danger is that Bosnia reverts back to three ethnically pure, we give up on the idea of a multi-ethnic Bosnia, three ethnically pure pockets, each of which is mutually hostile to the other. Does that remind you of anything? Well, those who know Bosnia should remember that was the plan of Karadzic and Mladic, which we have benignly, for all the best reasons, allowed to take root again. That's the danger.
Zrinka, that characterisation of Paddy Sale that for 10 years, and the list is truly impressive of what was achieved in those 10 years, when the memory of the war was so raw, and then about 10 years ago it started to unravel. Is that a characterisation you agree with? And if you do, what caused it?
I don't recognise that sort of development that Paddy described in the first 10 years because those were the most painful for me. So my personal interpretation would probably be slightly different because I was coming to terms with what I was discovering has happened in my country. I was working here with people who survived Omarska, Manjača and Karaterm, and ducking snipers in Sarajevo became like a joke in comparison to what I've heard they've encountered. And I got involved at Kemal and Mosmira for that particular reason. I've never been to that part of the country. I've tried to understand it. I've reread entire Hannah Arendt to try to understand the banality of evil. And I'm still grappling with that. So from my perspective, that's much harder to see I can see from the outcome-based point of view that these are the things that you can tick box. What is the impact of that if suddenly we go into this downward spiral? If you can only be a political representative in your country if you are Serb, Muslim, or Croat, or Bosniak and Croat, how can we ever get out of that situation? How can I cannot choose not to have ethnicity as prescribed by the status that, the situation in Bosnia as it is right now. So it is a sort of slightly, and this is what has, at one point I thought that something must have gone wrong in translating Dayton from English into Bosnian, because how on earth was it possible for this to go this terribly wrong? How on earth could we end up with a constitution where you can only, and the others, and we have these processes, and we're trying to follow the legal routes. There was a female representative of a progressive political party that had to take it to European court because she could not stand for political office as without any ethnicity. And these are the issues that are really complicated. And
it's the only country in Europe where you can't be president if you're a Jew, for
or
example.
Roma, or Ukrainian,
or a Protestant.
Or unexpressed.
Yeah.
And every conversation, imagine if four of us are now having a conversation that would start, Scottish, aren't you? And what's the weather like? Scottish. Do you see what I mean? So it's framing the conversation within nationalist, sectarian ideology it's very difficult to get out of that conversation right now on our own. So it's really difficult to say, oh, Bosnian citizens have the state and politicians that they deserve because they've elected them.
That's not what Paddy was saying.
No,
No,
I'm
it's
not
not.
saying that, but a lot of people might think that. Isn't that democracy? 20 years after the war, they have a constitution, they have human rights. Why isn't this happening? Bosnians refer to our system as kleptocracy.
It is a it's a sort of kleptocratic, theocratic state, unfortunately. The reason, Zinka, look, Dayton, I think we misunderstand Dayton. By the way, I think Dayton was a very great agreement, and I think if you're going to have peace in Syria, you're going to have to create something like Dayton, a regional agreement underpinned on the guarantor power of the great powers. But it was not an international agreement or treaty to create a state. It was an agreement to end a war. And all of those compromises we made, including the pretending there were 3 languages, 10 prime ministers, were necessary to end the war. 14. No, 14, that's right, because 10 in the Federation, and then there's 2 more, I can't remember what, Republika Srpska, 15. And there's a state prime minister as well, so it's 15 prime ministers. All of that was the compromises necessary to end a war. Actually, Dayton did very well. It stabilized the state. It ended the war, stabilized the peace for the first 10 years. Then we had to start building the state. And to build the state, we had to go beyond Dayton, which is what we did when we went to create a single army, a single intelligence service, a single customs service, a VAT system. Yeah. We used Dayton. I remember when I went there, I said, Dayton needs to be our floor, but it can't be our ceiling. We had to go beyond Dayton. So we had to, the Bosnian politicians and the international community, exercise political will to go beyond Dayton and build the functional state. We did that for the first 10 years, in the period I was there. It wasn't me, guys. It was extremely brave Bosnian politicians who worked with me. But we did that. And then Europe said, oh, Paddy's done it. We don't have to do any more. And they withdrew. And without that external will that you talked about, that whole process of building the functional state went immediately into reverse. So we are now back. You could always make a deal in Bosnia between the 3 ethnicities and those who controlled them at the political level, not the people, certainly not people like Kemal. I tell you what, you can have your own little pocket which you can control for corrupt purposes, and we'll let you all exist. Everybody will do that. But the secret of Bosnia was to fight the good fight for the basic principle that all of Bosnia needs to be a multi-ethnic state.
Or a non-ethnic state.
Or a non-ethnic state, yes. A non-ethnic state, even better. It is now tracking back to 3 mono-ethnic states, controlled by mono-ethnic politics, and exactly. And if you want to blame anybody for that, you cannot exclude the international community. In my view, bear a very, very great burden for their lack of attention these last 10 years and allowing.
But I want to ask Kemal something that you will also want to respond to. I know, Paddy, is that because while all this work was being done to build the institutions of a single Bosnian state that would embrace everybody, on the ground, people were using those reforms, weren't they, such as the right to restitution of property and so on, to go back. And as Paddy said, 1 million refugees went back and they got their property
No, they reclaimed their homes. They didn't all go back.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's the point I'm going to make. They went to reclaim their homes. They sold their homes, most of them, and then went to live in a place where their confessional group was in a majority. So, for example, Muslims sold homes in Banja Luka and moved to Sarajevo. Yeah. Serbs from Sarajevo sold homes and went to live in Banja Luka. And there was a voluntary segregation in that way.
No, honestly, Alan, Kemal will give the answer, but can I just give a view? Of course that happened. How could it not after a war of that intensity? But nevertheless, Kozarac, Prijedor, Srebrenica remained essentially less multi-ethnic than they were, but multi-ethnic. Sarajevo was less multi-ethnic than it was, but it was still multi-ethnic, broadly speaking. The real worry today, and Kemal will tell you what's happening in Prijedor, which is a classic example of this, is that even that lower level of multi-ethnicity is now in severe danger. I think that's what's happening, but Kemal knows.
Kemal.
Well, this is what I said to some young Bosnians in the States the other day. Talking about the current situation, I said the best thing the international community could have done back in 1995 was to send everyone back home to live under tents, you know, and then start rebuilding homes, and then maybe the effects of the war would be reversed. But 20 years later, we can't go back to that, so we have to deal with the current situation. My problem is always, you know, everyone talking about the problems, almost no one talking about solutions. So I'm very disappointed in the international community. I don't think the international community is going to do fuck all for us. We have to do something ourselves.
That's no.
So we have to institute some kind of change, and this is why I'm talking about young people. For example, one of the projects that Most Mira runs with young people brings together, members of different ethnic groups. And last year, when I talked to them after these protests, that they need to do something together. For example, some young Serbs said, well, other young Serbs will not join any initiative because they just want to spite, Bosniaks or Muslims in the Bosnian Federation. So I said to them, don't think about that. Think about, issues that bring you together, like unemployment. We have a whole army of young unemployed people in Bosnia, and it doesn't recognize anyone's ethnicity or nationality or whatever. Why don't you, campaign on issues like that? And what shocks me is actually they don't think about that. But if they see positive examples, then they will go forward. They will try to do something for themselves. And I've seen people being encouraged when they see others doing something. Then they realize, well, we've got the potential to change things for the better. And the number of young people actually who want to see a positive change is growing.
Okay.
So the protest last year, I don't want to be arrogant. I could see they were going to fail, but it was very important for them to happen, because before those protests, everyone thought, we shrug our shoulders and say there's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
And this is why I say that these grassroots level initiatives are really, really important. And I wish they are supported by our politicians. It's not going to happen. The biggest problem is the systemic. It's the systemic problem. I don't say it's the fault of our politicians, what we have in the country right now. If any one of you is in power right now under the current system, you will become corrupt within 6 months.
I wouldn't.
Well, let's talk about the I want to ask Anthony, who's just been there with fresh eyes. Let's talk about some of the problems, this unravelling of the state that was so painstakingly and courageously built up in the first 10 years after Dayton, the unravelling of it. What are the problems and dangers inherent in the consequences of that? Which somebody's talked about corruption, organised crime. What did you come across when you were there?
Well, I think one positive thing that I would say, Kamal's been talking about the younger generation, but amongst the war generation, and obviously when I was there, that was the young generation, but it's not now. The war generation is the middle-aged generation. There was a tremendous cynicism towards their own leadership. I didn't encounter people who were delighted with the Croat leadership just because they were Croats, Bosnian Croats, or their MPs, or were delighted with the Bosniak leadership just because they were Muslims. Far from it. I had one conversation with a woman I'd known in the war and was working with me as an interpreter, and she was technically Muslim. But I was talking to her about reconciliation and was going through the rather cliched English thing about, oh, yeah, but can you forgive the Serbs from this village that they did that and have reconciliation, forgiveness, yada, yada. And she's like, listen, yeah, I've sort of got over that. It's not a question of forgiveness. I've got over that. The people I can't forgive are the fellow Bosniaks in Bihać, where I was, who were charging, particularly two brothers, us 1,000 Deutschmarks for a 25-kilogram bag of flour in the war. 1,000 Deutschmarks for a 25-kilogram bag of flour to stay alive. That's where our savings went, our own fucking people. Our own people, who are now in those positions of power. And then I went on, and the deal this time I set myself was just to speak to people that I'd known in the war, was connected to, not find fresh people. Another family I found, their son had been one of 3 Bosnian prisoners of war, beaten, tied up, strapped with explosives, forced back over the line and blown up over their own lines. And I'd seen this family at various times throughout the war, after the war, and then again, this time, and it happened to be Croats who did that to this particular individual's brother. But he was sort of like, look, I'm beyond that. It's not, again, a question of, oh yeah, I forgive you, my Croatian brothers, come back. But it's just like, we both suffered. We both got our shit to deal with. But my immediate problems are economic and with our own leadership. And I guess he was talking about Paddy. He said, look, we couldn't even agree on a driving licence unless the High Commissioner hadn't told us what to agree on. And they were really sick of that. And I see that in a positive way as well as in a negative way, that there is a great awareness amongst the generation who went through the war that they were let down by their own leadership. And whatever darkness happened out there, they've sort of had to get on with it for simple economic reasons and worries. And I think that cynicism could conceivably be sort of used in a positive way, but I don't see that happening because...
Kemal first.
Well, one of the biggest problems we have in the country is that people who went through the war, who remember the war, they want their old lives back. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to get my old life back. We have to think of the future, and this is why I say we actually have to concentrate on these young generations. In a way, we have to write off these older generations because they're always negative about now, you know.
Well, I thought they've been quite positive.
But my experience often is that the younger ones are angrier than their parents.
Yeah. I mean,
because their parents at least remember a time of living together, of coexistence. Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to generalize because the same thing here is like the youth. You know, it doesn't really work like that for me. There are intelligent people in Bosnia of all ages who are trying to do something, and they've got solutions. I mean, Paddy was just speaking. I remembered K143. It's Coalition 143. It's a brilliant initiative of Bosnian people, Bosnian and Herzegovinian citizens, who came up with a solution that can get us possibly out of this situation, where we would have a representative political system based on 143 municipalities rather than ethnicities or sectarianism or nationalities. You know, I can pull out a Prezi right now in English for you. It's brilliant. But what they need international community, Americans in particular, to help create conditions for something like this to happen, because those who are sitting in power, there's plenty of money trickling in from abroad for them to be, pocketing. So they're never going to let that go.
Yeah, but the trouble with that is that when anybody proposes such a solution, one half of the country, again, I'm sorry to, Paddy and I have been falling out about this for 20 years, but one half of the country says, we've got a document here. It's called the Dayton Agreement that protects our autonomy. We Serbs.
But I'm sorry, Alan, those same Serbs, when it came down to it, went further than Dayton and combined the two armies into one under presidential control. It can be done if you find courageous politicians and they work in partnership with a political international community that's got the will.
Let's get on to that. What do the internationals have to do?
Can I just come back and just mention a thought for you? I don't take this view of Bosnian exceptionalism. I really don't. So Bosnia is corrupt. Every state after war is corrupt. Corruption follows like a dark shadow. You go to Italy after the Second World War, you'd have found it just as corrupt. You go to France, right through into the 1960s, you'll find exactly the same thing. I remember speaking to some East Germans who were helping us to create a criminal investigation service in Bosnia, and I said to them, is this place more corrupt than East Germany after communism? Absolutely not, they said. It's exactly the same thing. Nor do I accept the idea that there is a nomenclatura, which there is, which dominates the top of Bosnian politics. You find exactly the same in Northern Ireland. If you have a peace that ends an indecisive war, where the war is frozen, what you find is that the leaders of the war translate themselves into politics. If you don't create the rule of law as your first priority, you don't get a democracy, you get a criminally captured state. They create a thin crust of politicians at the top who control the states by appealing to their ethnic voting base, and no one can break through. I have a rule of thumb that in those kind of countries, of which Bosnia is one, Northern Ireland is another, you see exactly the same thing. You need two things. You need time, and you need to get rid of the generation who ran the war from the top structure of the politics. And if you look at Bosnian politics today, the people who are in charge are exactly the same people. The Zlatko Lagumdžias, Mile wasn't, but others who are running, Dragan Čović, who ran the war. And they use the peace for the same purposes as they use the war, to achieve the same things. What you have to do is you have to create a situation where the new generation breaks through. And that's why Kemal is so right. The solution in Bosnia, and what depresses me perhaps more than anything else, is I can't see them emerging with the power to begin to break through that thin crust of people who still dominate Bosnian politics, the same people who ran the war. When that happens, the next generation will give Bosnia a sustainable peace built around something different than preserving the fighting at the conflict of the war.
Zrinka.
I mean, I don't want to be completely negative all the time, but what has been happening lately is that you have war criminals who served their sentences and then going back and they've been celebrated and welcomed. So we're going back on that process as well, while the other ones are still waiting their sentences. There are positive things. We're junior basketball European champions, and it's a multi-ethnic team, and 50,000 people came out on the streets of Sarajevo to welcome them. But they had to self-fund to go to that championship. They had to find sponsors to go there. So how do we, there's one thing to be saying this is the solution, but what is the next step? What is the next step, Paddy? I asked you to go back. You said I need to talk to your wife. How do I talk to your wife?
The next step, the next step, it's not me. It really isn't me. And the Bosnians, I mean, Kemal and I were talking about earlier on, it is a Bosnian, no Bosniak habit to wait for the international community to ride over like the 7th Cavalry and save them. They've got to get involved themselves. But there is a dreadful failure of will at the heart of the international community. The capitals of Europe don't think they need to invest more in putting this right. Brussels gives in to every threat, or every threat of a threat that Mile Dodik makes. They're allowing the referendum to go ahead. They've permitted those in Republika Srpska to remove the word Bosnian language, which is enshrined in Dayton. Do they take action to take sanctions against him? No, they don't. That encourages everybody else to do the same things from the other ethnicity. There has to be an emergence of a new Bosnian political class that has the will to build a genuine European future, and it has to be backed by an international will to give them the assistance to make it happen.
A practical question. I was Googling, wanted to be up to speed on Republika Srpska referendum, and it's like a Groundhog Day. There's the same headline from 2009, then the same headline from 2011, and now the same headline from 2015. Now it's happening. He called the date on the 15th. And if you were a representative,
I'd declare it as a, I mean, I would reverse that. Well, that is a clearly anti-Dayton
So
move.
why INSCO is not doing anything about that?
Because Brussels won't back him to do it. That's the reason why. I mean, by the way, Mile Dodik's strategy is very simple. We know what it is. He's told us what it is. It's the same strategy as Milo Djukanovic in Montenegro. Make the state completely ungovernable and dysfunctional until the international community gives up the will to hold it together, and then we'll allow him to separate. It's exactly what Milo Djukanovic did in Montenegro. Mile Dodik said that's what he was doing. That's what he's doing. The international community are losing patience, and it will not be long.
And he's getting richer in the meantime, by the way.
But believe me, he's getting richer, because one of the reasons he wants to have a referendum against the state is because he's up for corruption charges before the state court, and he wants to make sure that it's moved away from that. That's a dangerous thing to say, but I'm going to say it. What the fuck?
It's time for me to say what the fuck as well.
It is.
Like everybody's swearing.
If the international community does nothing in the face of that, it will separate. And then, ladies and gentlemen, you will get conflict. Because that is the one thing the Bosniaks and the Bosniak pocket, which is now been allowed to become, will not tolerate. That they have been brought back to the position of Karadzic and Mladic. They won't object before that, unfortunately. I think we're being killed by the silence of the Bosniaks in Bosnia. They ought to be protesting on the streets about what's happening, but they're not. But that's what will happen.
My strong impression, Kemal, I went to the 20th anniversary Memorial Day at Srebrenica in July the 11th, and it was a huge gathering, maybe 50,000 people. Bill Clinton was there. You don't think it was 50,000? How many? 20,000. Okay, you were also there. Yeah, okay, 20,000. It was a lot. It was a lot, and it was also a funeral for 130 families. Yeah. Bill Clinton was there. Vučić was there, the Serbian Prime Minister, and it turned very ugly. And there was an awful lot of Allahu Akbar. There was an awful lot of a very explicitly and clearly and assertively Muslim identity being expressed in a way that I hadn't really come across before. Do you think people's Muslim identity is strengthened in...
I don't think it's got anything to do with Islam or their religion. I think it's about anger. For the first 10 years, we had huge improvements in Bosnia. And I was astonished when I said to myself, I've never seen a single case of revenge, and I was very pleased about that. And then, you know, when the international community stopped pushing our politicians to implement reforms. Now we even have the situation where the International Monetary Funds would say to our politicians, well, we'll give you more money if you implement these reforms. So they gave them some money, nothing happened, so they kept giving more money. Well, why do you keep doing that? So I think this is why I talk about these young people. So our future depends on these young people.
These were young people. These
Sorry?
were young people. I was surrounded by it at Srebrenica in July.
How old were they?
20s. In their
It's
20s.
Well,
definitely
that's-
got
that's
more
very-
of a Muslim
Those
identity.
are the people I'm talking about.
Forged in the war. I mean, of course it has. I mean, I think it's just, forgive me, but stepping into the realm of fantasy to say that Bosnia does not have a more clearly felt Muslim identity because of what it went through in the war. The war was fought along, you know, sectarian lines, and that's the way it cleaved people, and that's the way it focuses them afterwards. And to go and say now, oh no, hang on, they're not as Muslim as they were before, it's just, it's just out there. It's just out there.
When Dodik came to power, I could see what he was doing. He made one move, and the international, I don't even know what the international community is, but no one stopped him. So he tested them. So he made another move, nothing happened. So I basically said to some of the guys in my community, he started a propaganda war. And no one paid attention to that. So they started rewriting history. And this is what is causing this anger, you know, that people will talk about. I say we have to resolve this issue of the war. We have to talk about it. For example, I used to say, trying to explain to myself that what happened to me, I didn't deserve it. So I would say if my father were a war criminal, it had nothing to do with me. I was born in 1968. Then a couple of years ago, I realized, gosh, well, without my father, there is no me. So my father's history is my own history. And this is why we have to resolve this issue. And when you have these young people in Potocari who shout Allahu Akbar, it's because, you know, their family members were killed. And now, you know, certain politicians are saying that, you know, they were the people who were killed were the perpetrators.
It's happening.
And they're still not buried.
But
You know, it's still an open
But it
war.
is happening. Look, I agree with that. I mean, the miracle for me, Alan, is how little Bosnia and Herzegovina was radicalized by its experience. These guys lived through a war where the Serbs and the Croats wanted to destroy them completely. They wanted to wipe out the Muslim state. We let them die in incalculable numbers. They committed black deeds too over the war. 25,000 died in Sarajevo alone during the siege, while we did nothing. And then the Wahhabis came in and tried to radicalize them, and they did a little bit, but not much. They soon went away. Then the Wahhabis came in and built those mosques that you see outside. Very few people go to them. They look like, you can always identify a Wahhabi-funded mosque in Sarajevo. It looks like a nuclear power station. And you know, those little mahala mosques that live like parish churches, and they're the ones that are full.
The Ottoman ones.
The Ottoman ones. Actually, I am amazed. In any other country, this would have been radicalized end to end.
Yeah.
Are there now more radical young Bosnians than there were before? Of course there are. Look what's been happening elsewhere in the world. But they're still a small minority. Look, by the way, at the way that we've allowed them not to live in a functional state, that we have abandoned them as we did during the war. I'm amazed it's not more. They are there, they are growing, they are a threat. But the miracle, it seems to me, is that Bosnia is not, by and large, a great home
Right.
of jihadist.
One very quick, because I want to get the audience in.
You still see the same
Come on.
short skirts in Farhadia. You still see
Don't
those
point
little.
at me.
You still see those little columns of smoke going to an Allah that does not accept alcohol, at the bottom of which you will find a Slivovica still in every Bosnian cellar up on the mountains. These are still there. They wear their Muslim identity. Very likely, thank God, this is Europe's oldest Muslim population. They are not, by and large, radicalized. Leave them abandoned much longer, and they will be.
Well, one of the largest problems that we still have in Bosnia is the issue of the missing. So I was amazed that no one actually remembered to say, well, Vucic should be welcomed, and he should appeal to the Serbs to say where the remaining mass graves are, you know, and then there would be less people of these radicalized people. You know, it was a very good opportunity to do something positive, but everyone was playing politics, and it had nothing to do with the people who actually suffered and their family members who were present on that day.
This is a heart-achingly beautiful country, full of immensely capable and able people. It is an utter tragedy
let's get some questions from the floor. Who's
It's allowed it to happen.
a hand at the back there? We've got a microphone coming towards you, and then one further back. This gentleman in the. Oh well, okay. This one first, and then the one at the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. Perhaps it's a case of, in view of the comments made, we should perhaps simplify it to expletive deleted the international community. My name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former customs intelligence analyst. I worked 3 years in the CAFAO mission in Sarajevo and Banja Luka between 2002 and 5. My interpreter played the lead female part in the Love of Books dramatisation on BBC Storyville. My question is, and it's probably, and I think I've probably imagined the answer is not going to be optimistic. Is there any chance that the current migration crisis and challenges in the Balkans will revitalize the European Union member states, and the international diaspora states of Bosnia, Canada, US, Australia, into providing meaningful assistance? Because like all its Balkan neighbours, Bosnia will be having to deal with the refugee crisis. It will be helping us. Can we give them meaningful help across the board? And could I just say that I don't think anybody from outside Bosnia should go to work in the country who hasn't been there before, without listening to this programme. Alan Little's broadcasts on Radio 4 from Mostar, and Mr. Ashdown and Misha Glennie on Radio 4's The Reunion a few years ago.
Thank you very much. Very
And
kind.
Anthony's book as well.
Yeah,
Indeed, I haven't read it. I'll be buying it. Thank you.
Kemal also wrote a book, a very good book, which is.
Oh, yes. I'm going to
Zrinka.
write a book.
I'm going to use the
pension
F
plan.
word before the end tonight. Zrinka.
Oh, I mean, a friend of mine said Bosnia wanted to be more like Europe, but Europe, through this refugee crisis, is becoming more like Bosnia. And I'm heartbroken, really, and out of my mind most of the time. I mean, I'm used to. I have not slept properly for 23 years, but last couple of months just watching the exodus. And how it gently, refugees have found their way around Bosnia, clearly well informed, and watching those children crossing River Sutla in rain and mud. I just felt like the Europe has died in that mud under those little feet, for me. Bosnians, I mean, the response in Bosnia over the summer was, we're prepared, we can take some people. They were sending aid convoys, people understand. My mom was saying, if they come, maybe I should take one. There's a spare bedroom. But they won't come to Bosnia because they know Bosnia is a troubled place. They're on their way to Germany. And what is happening in Europe is absolutely disgraceful. And when we were talking before this evening, how ashamed we all are. I'm ashamed not only as a European citizen or now British citizen, or I'm ashamed as a human being. But what it does to me, it brings all the trauma on being Bosnian refugee, that we said never again once, we said never again twice. And what's the point of saying never again if we don't really mean it? So I'm worried about Europe, and that makes me worried about Bosnia. Because it seems incapable of getting its act together. I found comfort and solace in brilliant, responsive, ordinary citizens, and welcome that that they are closing the gap that the states have created. But it's not enough. It's not enough, and that's
Merkel.
Yes, I mean, Germany has been absolutely fascinating, and that's again a lesson for Bosnia, is how they came to terms, and maybe for Serbia, not perhaps Republika Srpska, but how Germany has come to terms with Holocaust and what impact it has. So they're responding in a very rational way, having learned from their history, not in an emotional way, oh, these are the people who are coming here, but Germany is very rational about their response. I was there a couple of weeks ago. Candidate for mayoral elections in Cologne was stabbed in her neck a night before elections because of her pro-refugee stance. She was in a coma on Sunday when she was elected mayor. So there's, you know, Germany is a sort of bit of a light, but I'm very, at the moment, heartbroken and pessimistic about it.
Anthony, you know better than almost anybody why and what those people are fleeing. And we used to despair of the international response in Bosnia 20 years ago, at a time when the European Union was growing in strength, was cooperating more than Europe had cooperated ever in its history. 1992 was the Maastricht Treaty. If the international community failed for 3 years in Bosnia to come up with a coherent response at a time of relative optimism, what does the international response to the Syrian crisis look like to you, since you've spent so much time there?
There's no silver lining anywhere at all. The prism through which I see a lot of Bosnia now, as Alan says, is through having reported on Syria frequently over the last 4 years. And at least looking back in Bosnia, the Clinton administration wasn't strong and extroverted, but it was prepared to play an increasing role. You had a far more unified Europe. Now we've got an America withdrawing from its spheres of influence everywhere across the globe. You've got no coherent foreign policy, I don't think, at all. You've got a Europe that's fraying and unable to agree on even the most simple aspects of foreign policy. And you've got a Syrian conflict as we see. You've got an emboldened Russia stepping in, which also has knock-on effects as we've seen in Bosnia, with the veto of the UN resolution to agree on the term genocide for Srebrenica, which was proposed by the British. The Russians vetoed it, along with Angola, China, Nigeria, and
the Russians will play mischief wherever they can. And forgive me, I've been very pessimistic, and I'm going to be less pessimistic on this one, to be honest. First of all, Syria is different. Syria is the fourth international intervention which we have royally screwed up from start to finish, and we still don't understand in the West that, because we're obsessed since shock and war, the idea that you see a problem in the world, the West's first instinct is to bomb it, and that's what we've done. We did it in Afghanistan, we did it in Libya, we did it in Iraq, and we've done it now in Syria. It doesn't work. This is the age of diplomacy. If only we'd deployed that 3 years ago, we might be in a different place. But, and Anthony's right, the terrible situation in Syria is, of course, the fountainhead of all of these people who are beating their path to us miserably across the dusty, but now muddy roads of the Balkans. I don't despair of Europe quite so much. Look, guys, this is not an easy problem to solve. 1 million refugees, 1 million and more, suddenly descend on your borders. At least Europe, they're making a bit of a mess of it. Of course, they're not slow. Did you really expect them to this quickly with such a sensitive political issue? They are, by and large, trying, some more than others. Hungary is inexcusable, self-evidently, but Merkel has, albeit that she's gone so far, taken such a risk that there is now a turn. But she showed real leadership. She stood up to our nation and said, they should come to us. They will change our nation. We need them. God knows, I wish we had one politician who said anything like that in a senior level in Britain instead of running away with it. At least Europe is struggling. They're not going to agree. It's going to be very difficult to do, but they are trying. Miserably, failingly, but they are trying. I don't feel ashamed of that. I think there are people genuinely trying to do better and deal with this problem. By the way, we look on this as an exception. It's not. This is the norm, and it is the new norm. It's how we have lived for century after century after century, with the exception of the last 50 years, when we've had floods of people driven by famine, by pestilence, and by war, flooding across Europe.
But mostly, if you compare it, mostly they've come to Britain. Britain hasn't been the country in Europe that's opened its doors.
Well, they have come to Britain.
Not now.
But that brings me to the point I want to reach to. And by the way, this is the new normal. If you think this is big, you wait till you get the floods of refugees coming from global warming. That's going to be huge. I was in Kuala Lumpur not long ago speaking to the ASEAN nations about it. They're aware of this. This is the future, guys. So we better sort out how we deal with it. And the only way to sort out with that is on a European level. It'll take us time to get there, but at least we're trying. I do not feel ashamed of Europe. I feel glowing with pride about Angela Merkel. I do feel ashamed of my own country. We have acted disastrously in this. Never mind 1.5 million. We've got 3,000 we can't deal with banging at the gates of the Channel Tunnel. And we won't deal with them. We've got 140 who turned up on British territory yesterday in RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. And we can't treat them properly. They're climbing over the fence. Before we start criticising Europe for their inaction, look at the shameful action of our own government that refuses to do anything, refuses even to do it with its European neighbours. And so in the face of a problem. If you want to be really angry with somebody, I'm not sure you should be angry at those in Europe who are at least trying. We should be a bit more angry about those in our own government who aren't even making the first effort to do something about this.
Yes.
Yeah, hi. You kind of glided past my question, but then we got onto another thing. Look, could we just define, two-part question, international community? Do you mean Europe? Because that often seems to be synonymous from Paddy's mouth. Or do you mean America as the biggest big brother, with Europe kind of coming behind it once it's decided where to put its chips down? Yeah. And then the second part of my question, once you've defined what international community is the international community today the same as it was 20 years ago, when Bosnia was allowed to disintegrate while Britain and France argued about best policies, and the UN was dragged in ineffectually, and it all went on until secretly the US had a course of arms through Croatia and allowed pushback after Srebrenica. And it wasn't until the US was fully involved and fully engaged that anything happened. So 20 years on, is the international community in the same place? Is my main question.
Is the international community, I mean, you said you didn't know what the international community was. I come to think it's a kind of meaningless phrase.
Well, I'd say 1995, the international community was the American national interest or the British national interest. As Paddy said, that interest doesn't exist in Bosnia anymore. So there's no international community. There are international organizations, and there are some really nice people there. One of them is a friend of mine who's trying to help people like me and us who work at Most Mira. But most of them, most of those internationals are just collecting their fat salaries and actually doing nothing. You know, a third-rate person. So I think it would be much better if that kind of money was given to the grassroots initiatives like Most Mira to do something for ourselves. So
Not that you're biased or anything.
The international
Paddy, I want to come to you last because you'll want to respond to the other three, I'm sure, as well as to that question. Anthony, what is the international community?
No, it's a term like mass media. It did exist sort of 20 years ago, and like mass media, it doesn't exist anymore. I think it's spheres of overlays of interest in some areas and not in others. I don't think it exists or it's particularly relevant.
Zrinka, is there an international community?
No, but there's international money. An international monetary fund.
Very good. Very good.
And that's part of the problem in Bosnia, I think, as is everywhere. So, and I think it's hiding a little bit behind this sort of international community.
There's also international
label.
law.
Yes, there is.
Paddy?
Yeah.
The international community does exist, and I'll try and define it for you in a moment. It has lost its will, it's lost its self-confidence, it's lost its ability to intervene. It's been so damaged in Iraq and Afghanistan that it's lost much of its respect as well. But it's there, and by the way, if you're in a position of the sort that I was in Bosnia, you use it, and it consists of all of the above. Don't belittle Europe, by the way. The Americans provided the hard power, the troops that we needed to keep the peace in S4 and I4 after Dayton, but Europe provided the soft power. If it hadn't been for Qatar, if it hadn't been for the European Union helping us build a VAT system, helping us build an intelligence system, a customs system, they were the ones who did more than anybody else to build the institutions of the state, which sadly for these last 10 years have been allowed to unravel. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, all of these I would use in order to provide help to my Bosnian partners to build the state that we all agreed we wanted to build. And so it is there. I don't accept the case that it's a sort of loose term. And by the way, if you say, well, it doesn't really exist, you immediately move one step to absolving us of our responsibilities, and you shouldn't. It was the international community that signed Dayton. It was the international community that gave the will, the strength, the money, the advice and the assistance and the military backup to make Dayton a reality, and it still could be.
My question, Paddy, was, now that you've defined it, is it the same today as...
No, I just said it isn't. It's lost its, you know, the policy of Brussels, particularly Brussels today, is the policy that got us into 1992. Always look for the easy route out, always give in to the threat. The threat nearly, by the way, always comes from the Serbs. It did in 92, it does today. We'll break the state up, we'll create chaos, and we give in every time. We find a new compromise, we find a new way around. We don't confront it, we daren't confront it. In the last, when I was there, we were constantly pushing things forward through crises, and they won't have a crisis nowadays. So I think it's lost its will, it's lost its self-confidence, but it is potentially still there. If we wanted to bring Milorad Dodik, to give one example, you could choose another in the Bosnian community, you might choose another in Herzegovina, and we wanted to say, up with this, we will not put, we could do that very easily. The European Union has more instruments of leverage and power in Bosnia and Herzegovina than in any other state. It has an EU4 force, it has a massive budget, it has a police mission, it has a European special representative, and it has half an international high representative with bomb powers. It just, its problem isn't that it hasn't got the instruments of manipulation and influence, it's problem that it hasn't got the will to use them.
Well, I completely disagree. I think the international community
I'm not saying it should, but it has.
The international community has become complicit in persecution of activists in Bosnia. You know, at the end of the war, we had 60,000 troops in Bosnia. Right now, we have about 600. And I read the other day that most European governments are willing to pull their forces back home.
That's what he's saying, isn't it? That there's no political will to. That's exactly what Paddy is saying, isn't it? Isn't it, Kemal?
But I mean, if you put a label of international community, then it's sort of who by name and surname and function is going to do something if you don't hold them accountable, if they're just hiding behind a label. I mean, again, there's no interest, there's no self-interest. We're now in the cracks of American election. Again, like at the beginning of the war. When, I think, during the Bush campaign in '92, he landed somewhere. Clinton said something about Bosnia. He came at the airport and made a statement about Bosnia, and he said Sarajevo. He pronounced J in Spanish. And I thought, we're fucked.
The answer is, I was the international community. I mean, I was responsible to them. Brilliant. I was responsible to the international. I was the international community's high representative. I was the person. I was responsible to the Bosnian people as well. I was accountable. The problem is today there are still a high representative there, but no one will back him with the will to do things. I'm not saying you should blunder around and use the bomb powers. I don't believe that's true. There are all sorts of other ways you can influence, particularly to help the good people in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I don't think that the issue is that there aren't the people. The issue is no one will support the people whose jobs are there.
Well, there's no interest, like, you know.
That is also true.
That's the problem.
That is also true.
There's no oil, there are no diamonds.
It is very true that I remember for the first 10 years, if you were to walk into a European Secretary of State, the Foreign Affairs Office, and you said the word Priador or Prozor, they knew where it was, because it was part of their
legacy. Yeah.
Nowadays, what? There isn't an
Go back to Sarajevo.
There isn't the knowledge.
Sarajevo.
Yes.
Let's get a question there.
Thank you. I'm Clive Baldwin. I was a lawyer for Jakob Finci, who's the Jewish leader you've alluded to, who took a case to the European Court of Human Rights and won it, challenging his exclusion or discrimination against him because he's classified as an other. But we won that case 6 years ago, and nothing's changed. Even though for several years it was the EU's top issue, they said, and they put it on the agenda. Now they've given up on that too. But if the system, both domestic and international, can't even fix an issue like discrimination against the others, what's the solution? How do we get to a modern constitution for Bosnia? Given the current constitution is still an annex to the Dayton Agreement, if incremental steps don't work, is the best way now just to scrap it all and start again?
Remind us what happened after in effect, the Bosnian constitution was declared illegal by that court case, wasn't it?
It's the only time we found afterwards at the European Court that a constitution has been declared to violate the European Convention of Human Rights.
And it hasn't been changed.
And it's not been changed.
Because the European Union have given up on Sage Finci. That's exactly right. But, you know,
I don't think it...
Go on. I'm trying to be optimistic.
There's a new one. There's the Azra Zornic is a woman who's taken it on the grounds of not wanting to be labelled and wanting to not being the other, but not having to stand with a sectarian.
For a non-ethnic constitution rather than a multi-one.
Undeclared, unexpressed. And she won again. And again, that was last year, I think.
Changed.
And there's still nothing changed.
Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm struck by how one-dimensional the whole identity politics seems to be. It seems to be all about religion, ethnicity, nationality, and there don't seem to be any other dimensions. There doesn't seem to be a colonial, anti-colonial dimension as there is in Northern Ireland and Syria. There doesn't seem to be any class conflict. There doesn't seem to be a left or a right. There doesn't seem to be an organised labour movement. There doesn't seem to be a women's movement. We've heard a bit about British and American interests, which presumably is a kind of economic imperialism. But it hasn't been developed. You've talked about a different cultural form, or a specific cultural form, which is the basketball, but we hear nothing else about, you know, what goes with ethnicity. Is it the art? Is it the music? Is it the culture? It's all very vague, what actually binds people into these collectivities.
Well, I mean, there is a very strong workers' movement, but they're being sold. And the street is the only space that they have. They have no power or mechanisms through which they can affect change. And nobody's paying any attention. There is one strike or the other. There's a protest here and there. But they're just being dismissed. Farmers did the same thing. So they're completely marginalized within the context. And the primary identity is that ethnic one. And that's why they're banging on about it, because it's defining the power. Because that's how the framework was set with Dayton in order to cease fire, because these were the warring parties. And even though all the three presidents who signed Dayton are now dead, it's just perpetuated itself.
But people voted along sectarian lines in the first elections before the war.
But look, I'm sorry, I do not accept this business of Bosnian exceptionalism. It is exactly the same in Northern Ireland. I am the son of a Northern Irish Protestant mother and a Catholic father. When I went to school, they said to me at the age of 5, well, what are you, Paddy? Are you a Protestant or are you a Muslim? So I went back and asked my dad, said, Dad, am I a Protestant? Sorry, a Protestant or a Catholic? I said, hang on, wait for it, it's getting there. So I went back and I said to my dad, well, Dad, am I a Protestant or a Catholic?
We converted.
And he said, listen, he said, go back and tell him you're a Muslim. So I went back and said, I'm a Muslim. And they said, well, are you a Protestant Muslim or are you a Catholic Muslim? So it's exactly the same. Listen, there may be a colonial history. There may be a colonial history, but believe me, in Northern Ireland, this is religious. You have them, it pretends to be. Religion is the vehicle. There is you don't have to go to Bosnia to find a political class that finds it convenient to appeal to a particular ethnic or religious group in order to preserve their own power. And what happens is, after the war, they say, you better vote for me as a Bosniak, you know, because you remember what the Serbs did to you. If you don't vote for me, if you don't stand together, they'll do it to you again. And that's the basis. But you find exactly the same in Cyprus. You find it in Northern Ireland. Bosnia is not exceptional.
I mean, there's an interesting point that you've made about colonialism, and people do forget that Bosnia was a colony up until 1914. Of Austro-Hungarian Empire, before that Ottoman Empire. So there is a bit of a mentality and relationship to power, is that they come and they go. And
it was
they
a
oppress.
province. It was a province rather than a colony.
Well, you know, who was in charge?
Okay.
Who was in charge of money? So that and then before that Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. So the last time Bosnia was independent, it was 16th century, where it had that sort of ownership and structure, and it was a kingdom. So it's still very early in our history that we can position ourselves as a sort of proactive and owning power in a way that you expect citizens in democratic society to do, because we still carry that, you know, whoever's in power is going to screw us up no matter what.
Just one quick thing, Paddy.
You do that in Britain too.
One quick thing to argue that for people to ask why identity politics remains so strong when there are good reasons for class-based politics and so on is not necessary to argue for Bosnian exceptionalism. I don't think anybody here is arguing Bosnian exceptionalism.
That's fair, but what I'm trying to say is This is not uniquely Bosnian. You don't have to go to Bosnia to find people arguing the case for.
Sure, but that doesn't make it all right.
No, absolutely it doesn't. And the thing that used to confuse me was I could never understand why the ethnically based politicians didn't argue about unemployment, didn't argue about dirty streets, didn't argue about housing. If only we could shift the debate away from there, but resolutely in Bosnia. And by the way, guys, go to Belfast. You will find, until recently, exactly the same thing.
Because what they've got in common is that conflict or division is their power base.
Exactly. Yeah. That's the point I was trying to make, but you make it better than I did.
For what?
So standing for?
Yes, there's somebody here.
My question is how many who fled the war went back? I mean, after getting graduated at uni or going to school together, I mean, Croatians, Serbians, whatsoever, they usually go to the same class at times. Abroad, maybe in Germany, maybe in the UK, go to uni, they have a different experience. Also, they're maybe the next generation of those of the parents who experienced the war, who showed them videos, who were very little. How many went back? I would guess not many because of the economic circumstances, but still, do they somehow change the way they see each other? Because
this is an interesting question, isn't it? Because Zrinka, you mentioned the diaspora and your ability to go back with Western salaries and money and power and freedom and so on. And that division in Bosnia is very strong now between those who lived through the war and stayed and those who left and found a life in the Western democracies. How does that play out?
I mean, it's really weird because it's very emotional reunion, usually with lots of drink. But what's really interesting is that a lot of the time, my friends who stayed behind don't really ask me what's life like in London. There's this sort of cocoon of Sarajevo. It's almost like no matter how we're doing abroad, we're somehow doing better. Even though many of my friends are doing very well, they have a good quality of life, they have dream jobs, they're producing films, they're artists, they're writers, journalists, but somehow this idea that we got away, and no matter how hard the life is out here, it's still better. And a friend of mine explained this to me, and he said, I wish I could just go once to see a doctor without having to bribe them. Like, I wish I could know what that feeling is, that I could operate on a daily basis without having to bribe my way through it. And that's something that I've forgotten, because we have NHS. As bad or good as it is, you don't have to bribe your way through it. And it suddenly hit me that what a privilege it is to live in this way, and what restrictions people experience, that they're trapped. Yeah. And that is and last year 68,000 mostly young people left the country. And this is and the country is 3.7 million people. That's half of London. Do you know what I mean? So it's when 68,000.
And before the war, it was what, 4.4?
Something like that.
4.2 or something.
4.2. So, so this is where the challenge is in terms of, even though people appear to have a great life, it is in a cage, and the despair is lurking somewhere in the background, and that's part of the challenge of how do we change this, and what we as diaspora can do, because it's really hard for us to fit into any of these processes yet, because obviously we have other lives, but there's also guilt. It is heartwarming to see children, especially children that we work with in Prijedor, when they get together. Yeah. And they existed their entire lives in separate locations, grew up with separate narratives, and go to separate schools and are taught separate curricula and different versions of history. They read different writers. In Herzegovina, they are in the same school, but they have breaks at different times, so they wouldn't mix.
They use different entrances and exits.
Exactly. But in Prijedor, where Mostmir is working, they're physically in different areas. And one school was a camp. It's a primary school where kids now go to school. It used to be a camp. It used to be a prison.
I want to get camp.
So it's really, I mean, you can say more, but for me, having not been to that place ever before in my life, to see how easily, if you give them content, if you open up a space, how easily kids get over it and they just focus on fun, on something positive.
But this question of the diaspora there was one very striking symbol of this. When was it now? Where are we? Last year, I was back in Sarajevo in the summer when Bosnia played in the World Cup, in the football World Cup, the real World Cup, and it was a great morale boost. The whole city was excited, but what was quite telling about it was that every single member of that squad of young men, except one, grew up in the diaspora. They were all diaspora kids. They were all kids whose parents left during the war. There was only one local boy in the entire squad, and that was very emblematic of the difference in fortunes between those who left and those who stayed. Those who left got, in many cases, not universally, but for the most part, got the kinds of opportunities that had been denied the generation that stayed and grew up in Bosnia. What is your experience? You left and went back.
Well, in former Yugoslavia, we were used to being given jobs. You know, you just had to graduate from university and get a job. I didn't have that privilege. When I was looking for work, it was a time of crisis, it was tough. So my story is perhaps a little bit different. I had to fight for everything in my life, and perhaps that's why I'm speaking differently. Life isn't easy. We need to fight for things. And so when I talk to young Bosnians abroad, I say, well, for me, they are that real change because they have been embraced by these other communities. They got their education. They worked with people who are different. And this is, something that we have to relearn in Bosnia, how to work together, how to live together, and how to embrace our differences. And I always tell them, we should all go back. Of course, it's much, we've got this saying, it's not so easy to dismount a horse and to mount a donkey, But we have to take risks in this life. I hope it didn't sound wrong in English.
Bosnian wisdom explains everything.
But what we have to do right now is actually to keep those young, talented people who are in Bosnia right now, than rather expect people who have comfortable lives abroad to come back. Because without these young people in Bosnia, there is no Bosnia, there is no future. So, and this is actually what I'm sorry, I have to promote Most Mira here, but this is what we have been trying to do, to encourage these young people that they've got the power, that they are the change. And what you asked earlier, and I agree with Paddy, this is all about money and power and about controlling people in our society. And we tried to change young people's way of thinking.
Okay, it's 5 minutes to go. I'm going to take one more question. Before I do that, just give us the Most Mira web address.
It's mostmiraproject.org.
Thank you. Mostmiraproject.org.
And Most Mira means the Bridge of Peace.
Yes.
So, without the international community, this panel seems to be...
Can you put the microphone a little closer?
Oh, sorry. This panel is kind of putting its faith in Bosnia's younger generation to make the country better. But I was there recently, and they feel really trapped by the straitjacket of Dayton. So, who's going to free them from that?
They're going to free it. Only they can break Dayton now. Only they can move away from Dayton. The international community hasn't got the will to enforce Dayton in the way that it should. So it is down to them. If they won't do it, Bosnia won't have a future.
And they will do it.
And they will.
Well, they have to realize it's their country. It's not, the country doesn't belong to our politicians. This is what I keep telling them all the time. It's as much your country as it is, of those politicians. So they have to start thinking differently.
I mean, there already are really progressive forces. So I don't call them young, I call them progressive. And you have, it's like a couple of years in Prijedor, there was one guy who stood in the main square with a white ribbon commemorating the massacre that happened there, where 122 children, I think, were murdered.
102, I think.
And then next year, next year, because that municipality is refusing to commemorate, to put a plaque, to put a monument, to in any shape or form recognize that this crime has happened there. The year after that, it was 30, 50 people, and then it was 400 people. So, and they're making it non-sectarian. So they're remembering all victims. And these are the young people who we work with Most Mira now growing up, and what they need is support. They need to be heard, they need to be recognized, they need support from diaspora, from European Union, international community, because they're operating in hostile environment. So if, you know, they're the little pockets of action and hope and progressiveness and ideas and creativity. And, you know, so how do we identify them and how do we continue supporting them is the challenge.
I'm going to say, I said one last question, but there's the man who challenged my figures on Srebrenica has got the microphone now, so.
The reason I challenged is because 100,000 people show up at a festival in Bosnia which has nothing to do with reconciliation, and 20,000 people show up to a funeral, which I go to every year, but that's besides the point. What I wanted to ask is, while I agree with you that the young generation is the future of Bosnia, do you think that Bosnia has enough time as a united nation to see that next generation come through?
That's the question. That's the question. Do you want to go?
Paddy, please, yeah.
Well, I'll try not to be too long. But first of all, that's the question. You know, it's a race between catastrophe and salvation. And Dodik has now taken certain steps, not the least is the referendum, plainly anti-Dayton. And I hope the international community will, at this stage, act strongly to declare that illegal under Dayton and take sanctions if necessary. Isolate the man completely. Withdraw the funds, etc. I remain, for all of this, and it's been quite a gloomy evening, my time in Bosnia, now nearly more than 10 or 15 years, I've grown deeply to love the place. It's the most eye-wateringly beautiful place. If you haven't been there, go. This is filled with some of the most capable and able people. And the tragedy comes in three forms. The first is that they were on their way to a functional state. They were on their way to making it 10 years ago. And the picture that Anthony very accurately painted earlier on today it's such a tragedy of lost opportunities that we've allowed that to happen, that we've allowed the worst aspects of Bosnia to assert itself instead of the best, instead of backing the best. The second tragedy is if ever the world needs a bridge between Christendom and the Islamic religion, it's now. This is the great geopolitical problem of our time. And Bosnia can be that. This is a 1,000-year-old Muslim population. Izetbegovic, the old man, used to say to me, I'm a Bosnian and a Muslim and I'm a European, and I see no contradiction between any of these things. So this could have been a model. It could have been something really important, can still be. And the third is this, that if there was a principle for which the war was fought amongst the Bosniaks, and I think we did as well, Alan, and the international community, it was that somehow or another, in this remarkable city of Sarajevo, that principle that rose above ethnicity, of course it was the Bosniaks largely fighting, but the Serb cathedral was never touched, nor indeed the Croat Roman Catholic cathedral ever touched, was the thing we fought for. That was the principle of Europe. And you know, that's what it can become again. There's a wonderful poem, forgive me, by Tagore, which says, we are all the more one because we are many, for we have left an ample space for love in the gap where we were sundered. Our unlikeness shines with the radiance of a common creation, like mountain peaks in the morning sun. It is our unlikeness that's the greatest revelation of our humanity and our divine, whatever divine you happen to believe in. Bosnia has been and can become again the symbol of that. If the people of Bosnia and its young people can do it, and against all the odds, I remain an optimist that they can, because of people like Kemal.
I think that's a great place to stop. Quick thank you to all of you for coming. It's been great. Thanks for engaging so intelligently and so enthusiastically with this. Thank you very much, especially to the Frontline Club and all that it's come to stand for in our community. And most of all, thank you to these four. Thank you.